be used, or the reports that you're going to build using the SSRS, where it would be used. Okay, so let's say in the company, if you have the requirement, if you're working on the SQL Server and there are reports in the company that you would need to create for the business people, that they would need the reports to be run every day. Okay, so there are two kind of reporting. There is one could be the ad hoc report, and the one would be that would be needed like every day. Okay, so if those are the ad hoc reports, it's not a good idea to build in the SSRS. So the SSRS reports would be only those that would need like everyday kind of thing that has to be run every day. Okay, so when I say the ad hoc report, it's just needed for one time, like in 6 months or in a year. Okay, that kind of reports are ad hoc. But if the reports that needs to be run very often by different people in the company, that could be put on the report server. Okay, so basically what you do is you create a template in the Visual Studio. This is the tool that you use for the reporting services, the Visual Studio. And if you have installed the Visual Studio, it would ask you, do you want the business intelligence way to be set up? So when you set up the Visual Studio as a business intelligence way, it gives you 3 different kind of projects. Okay, so when you look in the projects, it's going to give you analysis services, integration services, and reporting services. So all of the 3 business intelligence in Microsoft SQL Server are done through Visual Studio. Okay, so either it's a reporting services, integration services, or analysis services. Now what you do is, once you have the project created, you would be creating report inside your project within the reporting services. Okay, so you can have multiple reports that are built, and when you create the templates for the reports, these are the local templates. What you need to do is, once you're done creating the report the way you need, you deploy it on the report server. Okay, so right now we are just building it locally in the Visual Studio. You don't need to have the report server. But when we're gonna go into the deployment process, we're gonna see how to deploy those reports, where they're gonna sit, how the report server can actually be installed, and what are the configurations that you would need to do in order to get access to the report server. Okay, like if the persons who are using the report server from outside, or any other person who is not a developer, if the business person, he has to get into the report server, how you can assign roles to them, that kind of stuff, how they can get the subscription out of the report server. So there are different features that we're going to discuss in the SSRS. Okay, now when you use the SSRS reporting, it could be on the different databases. Okay, so when I say the different databases, I mean is it could be on the relational database. Okay, it could be either on the cubes. So cubes are nothing but the multidimensional database. The multidimensional database are used when you have a very huge relational database. Let's say you have like terabytes of data in the relational database, and when you try to query the data from the relational database, it takes forever, like 5 minutes to run the report. And that time, what the people will do is they aggregate the data that they would need and put it in the cube. Okay, that is nothing but the analysis services. And then using the analysis services, the cube is created. That is another layer on top of the relational database. Okay, so it's more like a database, but it runs on top of relational database. Okay, so what you do is you create the cube, and then you put the data in every night, process the cube. It means what you're doing is you refreshing the data from your relational database to the cube, and then the reports are ran from them. So what does it do is, the reports that used to run for like 5 minutes, now it's running like in seconds or so. Why? Because the report that need the data is already in the cube. It's pre-aggregated. So let's say if you know SQL, what you do is to aggregate the data, you use the group by, right? So when you do the group by in the report, you're aggregating the data, but the cube has all those things, everything in there already, like aggregated the data by group by however you created the cube. Okay, so what it has to do is it just goes in the cube and fetch all the data. So it doesn't have to do a lot of processing to put all the records in one group and then aggregate the data. Okay, so cubes would be seen, but only when you have a very huge relational database. Okay, so the SSRS supports both of them, but the difference is when you're reporting from the relational database, you would be writing queries in SQL. Okay, But when you are reporting, when you're doing the reports from the cube, you will be writing queries in MDX. The advantage here is when you're doing in the Visual Studio, you don't need to know the MDX or the SQL. You need to know the basics of the SQL, like what is group by, what is having, what is where clause. But everything you can write the whole query using the GUI in the Visual Studio. Same with the cube as well. So either you are on the relational database or the multidimensional database, you don't need to know much of the query. If you can write the query, that would be good, because what happens is when you are on the relational database, most of the reports can be done via stored procedure, and that is the preferred way. We're going to talk about why do you do via stored procedures as compared to the writing query in the report itself. Okay, so if you have like written the whole stored procedure for running the reports, you just call the stored procedure in the report and that's it. Okay, so you don't need to use the GUI or anything to create the queries. You write everything native in the SQL Server, and then you come here and call that stored procedure. Okay, and for the MDX, for the cube, we're not going to go how to write the MDX. What we're going to use is we're going to use the GUI, and we'll see how can you write the MDX queries within the GUI. Okay, this is a query that is written on the cube to fetch the data. In the same way the SQL is ran on the relational database to get the data. So MDX is a multi-dimensional expression that is used to get the data from the cube. So cube doesn't understand SQL. If you write a SQL query on the cube, it's not going to understand. Okay, so MDX is another kind of SQL that is for the cubes. Okay, all right. So the MDX, you don't need to much worry about it. The GUI in the SSRS is so good that all the things that you want to do with the MDX, you would be able to accomplish. Like same with the SQL, what you want to write SQL queries, you would be able to use GUI and do it. The same way MDX, you don't need to much worry about that. And the MDX, it's, if you are doing the reporting, no one would ask you, do you need to know the MDX? It's fine. If you don't know MDX, it should be fine. Okay, but if you're working on the cubes and then you have the performance tuning of the cube, or when you're building the cube, that MDX might come in play that time. Okay, but for the reporting, it's just GUI would be enough. Okay, so what I did is I had the reports. First we're gonna see how the report, what kind of report we're gonna make. Okay, what kind of report we're gonna work on, and then we're gonna build the report in the separate project in our class project. Okay, so what I wanted to do is, let's go ahead and create the project. Yeah, so when reporting services, in the reporting services, you're going to see two different type of options in here: report server project wizard and report server project. The report server wizard, the first option that you see, is more when you don't build the report from the scratch. What it does, the report server or like the Visual Studio do is, you take you step by step what need to do. Okay, create the data source, create the data set, and then it will take you to the report, and then you start building the report. But instead of that, what we're going to do is we're going to do everything from the scratch. So that's Visual Studio doesn't have to tell like, okay, this is the time to create data source, this is the time to create a data source for the report, this is the time to create the data source for the project. So we skip that because that is more like when it's more like when you don't know much about SSRS, you go with that. But if you know how to build the report from the scratch, you would go with the report server project, and then you say, okay, I want to call my project name as April 2017. Okay, create the project. I clicked OK. What it's going to do is it's going to create the environment for the SSRS. Side, you see the Solution Explorer, right? So the Solution Explorer is for your project. Okay, in Solution Explorer, you're going to see three folders: shared data sources, shared data set, and the reports folder. The shared data sources is the data source that you create. So let's say if you have 10 or 20 reports in your project. Okay, if all the 20 reports are running from the same server and the same database, what you can do is you can create a shared data source, and then within the report, when you create the report, you can point the data source to the shared data source. So what it will help is you just having one data source connection for all the 20 reports that you have in the project. We're going to see what's the advantage when you create a shared data source versus the data source inside the report itself. Okay, so think about this. If your server got updated to 2016, okay, from 2014 to 2016, and your server name got changed. So if you have the data source that is configured at the report level, so what you do is you create the report, and inside the report you are doing the, let's see in here. So inside the report you have an option to do the data source, okay, and so this is inside the report. So once I open the report, you're gonna see this report data tab, okay, and inside the report you have the data source. So you can configure the report data source either using the shared one. So this right now, when you see the arrow in here, it's pointing to the shared data source, or you can create the data source within the report itself. So think about if you have 20 reports and you create each individual data source for 20 reports, and your server name got changed, okay, because you upgraded. What you need to do, you need to go in all 20 reports and you have to change your server name. Instead, if you had the shared data source for your report, all of the reports that uses the shared data source, what you need to do is you need to go to the shared data source that you have and you change the link in there in just shared data source, and all the reports, because they are pointing to shared data source, automatically will be converted. You don't need to go in each of them and change the report project, okay, or the so that's just not the one advantage of it. The another advantage, think about it, when you create the reports, where you will be working in, you will be working in the development, and then you move your reports from development environment to the QA. So the QA person can go in and check if the reports are working the way it's wanted, the logic is correct, the formatting is correct, everything, right? So when you move the reports from development to production, what's going to happen? Or development to QA to production, you would be changing the link every time for the reports, right? So that's the another advantage. If you have the shared data source, you just change the link to the server. That is because you can have like a dev on different machine, QA on different machine, and prod on different machine. So moving the reports from one environment to other environment is very easy in that scenario, okay? So the shared data source is, it's always good practice to use, okay? All right. Only time that I would see that you would be using the data source within the report, it's just if you have one report, one or two report, but that is not the case most of the time, okay? So in here, under the Solution Explorer, I had the shared data sources, the shared data sets. The shared data set is nothing but the same thing. You will see the data set at the project level and the data set at the report level. And data set is nothing but the query that you're going to write in the SQL to fetch the data. Okay, that's your data set. So let's say if you write one query and that it gives you the result, that is your data set. So you have the shared data set and the data set. Now you can think about the data set is always going to be particular to the report, right? Because it's not going to be that let's say if you're pulling the data for one of the data set would be for the sales, one of the data set would be for the production. You have the production report, you have the sales report. So you have different kind of reports. Each of the reports going to have different data set. What could be the common among those reports? If you have 20 reports, what could be the common thing in the report within the data? So let's say if your company logo, or the name of the company, or the header of the report, or the footer of the report, where you have the address of your company. So if any of those things you can derive from the database, you would create logo or name of the company or the address of the company from the shared data set. Because if any of those things changes, you don't need to change the same concept with the data source, right? You don't need to change all the reports one by one. So what you do is you create a shared data set, and then what you do is you create the SSRS template, and then you're going to use the same template. So what it's going to do is it's going to use the shared data source for the name of the company, logo, and then the address in the footer kind of thing. Okay, so for that you can use the shared data set. But if it's the report data, like how my sales is doing, what is my production, all that can go in the data set, because you know you're not going to share those kind of data, or that won't be used in like all the reports. It just be used in one report that is particularly we are running. So if I have the sales report, I would be putting my sales data in just that report. I don't need it in the other reports, right? So you would be, that time you would be creating the data set within the report, okay, which are specific to the reports. Okay, now the third folder that you see in here is the reports folder. So all the reports that you would be creating would be seen in here. So if you have to add a report, let's go back to our project. So what I would do is I have to get started, right? So I would do is I would add a new report in my project. Okay, so there are two ways. Either you can add an existing item. Let's say if you have a report that exists in the other project, you can bring that in here. So you click on existing item and then you browse for that report where you have, okay, or you can do the new item. Okay, so when you click on add new item, it says, okay, do you want to do the report sorry, yep, we're gonna see that. Yeah, we're gonna create that one. First we create the report. So once you have the report, so I'm just trying to talk about like the windows that you're gonna see, and then we're gonna create. So I have to create, yep, I have to create a report in order to get other windows working. So yeah, because you don't see the design window, preview window, or we can work in here as well in the other one. So like all these windows are not enabled until you have a single report in the project. Okay, so what I do is, let's say when I click on the report and I say, okay, add new item to my report, it gives you what item do you want to add. Do you want to add a report? Do you want to add a data source? Or do you want to add a data set? So let's say I just say for now, I want to add a report to my project. At the bottom, you're going to give the report. I'm going to say simple tabular report. Okay, so first we're going to see is a tabular report. So I'm just giving the name right now, simple tabular report. Okay, 01 underscore. Okay, so I say 01 underscore simple tabular report. I click add. And once the report is added, you're going to see the report data pops up, and then your screen for, okay, so report data, I'm going to pin it so I can see the whole thing all together. Okay, so in here you have to ask the question, because this is more like, you know, interactive class, so it's not you have to wait. So don't worry about, you know, asking questions in between. So now if you see in here, once you have the report added, you would see a couple of windows popped up, right? On the left hand side you would see the report data, right? So this window is specific to the report. If you go on another report, you're going to see this window there, but these things would change. The built-in fields, the parameters, the images, data source, data sets. So all these are particular to the report. Okay, so we're going to see over what are these report data tab is, and then in between you will see your work area for the report. So creating the report template, this would be your do you see the black box in here? So you can drag and drop the tables in here and start creating it. Okay, and once you do design, and then you have the preview as well. So you don't have to deploy the report in order to see it. What you can do is you can use the Visual Studio when you're working in the development, and you can see how the report looks like. Do I need to stretch out the field? Is it taking like 2 or 3 lines just for the data that I have in the field, or the formatting is correct or not? So those kind of things you can check it in the preview windows. It would be, everything would be as I mean similar what you're gonna see it in the real-time report kind of thing. And on the bottom you're going to see there are 2 columns in there, the row group and the column group. So that is more when you have to group the data within the report. Okay, so let's say you bring the raw data in, and then you have to group by the data within the report. We would be using these 2 things. Okay, so group by row and group by column. Okay, within the report itself we can use the group by. Okay, so with said that, now let's try to walk over what are the different options that you have within the report. Built-in fields these are the, if you click on the small arrow that you see in front of the built-in fields, it will expand over, and then you will see there are lots of options in there. So when you run the report, you might have seen or like when you have run the, when you took the printout from the Google Mail or Gmail or Yahoo, you would see the header and the footer with your Gmail, and then at the bottom it's the link from where you did the printout. So let's say the same thing in the report. What you want is who is the user that ran the report, how many total number of pages are there, what is the name of the report, you need it in the header. So the name of the report is nothing but this one. The user ID would be when the person is on the report server, they would need to log in the report server. So from which login ID that report is ran. All this kind of built-in fields can be used in the header or the footer or in the body of the report. Okay, anywhere, wherever you want. So let's say if you have like 20 pages report and you want to give the page number, this option can be used. Okay, how many total pages are there? So we're going to use all these options in the report. Don't worry about it. I'm just trying to first get introduced the things where things are in the Visual Studio. Okay, so any of the execution time, what language the report ran, and all these options are available in here. Okay, now the second thing is the parameter. So the parameter are nothing but, let's say when you do the filter on the report, right? So let's say you have the 50 pages report and it's for the 5 different companies you have inside your company, or if you have like 5 different categories: production, sales, operations, HR, human resources. So what you want to do is you don't want the user to run the whole report. What you want is you want to ask the user for which sector in the company you want to see the data. So you give them the options and they pick, okay, I want to see the data for this time HR and the sales. So they pick 2 options and then the report runs only for those 2. So it doesn't run for all the options that you have in your databases. Okay, so it won't generate like the huge report, the thing that they won't need it. So parameter is basically, it's a filter to the report that they can pass before running the report first time, and they can keep changing those parameters. Okay, the third folder in here is the images. So let's say if you have sometime what happens is you're creating a report that is image page. So let's say if you're selling the products within the company, and then you have images for each of the product. So what you're doing is you're creating a report with the product name, the image of the report, what's the price, how many quantities you have available. So you can import the images in this folder, and then the RDL would contain this. The RDL is nothing but the extension for the SSRS reports. Okay, so like the word has the docx document extension. So the report that we have created in here in the solution explorer, it has the extension .rdl. Okay, so in the RDL it will contain all the images within this RDL file. So RDL is nothing but it's an XML formatted file. Okay, and when you import the images, what it will do, if you have 100 gig of images, I'm just saying this RDL would be 100 gig. Okay, so basically all the image that you export inside the image folder would be stored within the RDL. Okay, there are different ways of doing it. We're gonna see when we're gonna come across into the detail. Then the data source, we talked about it, the shared data source and the data source. This data source is at the report level, and this data set is at the report level as well. So the data set is for what kind of data that you need to get from the database. So if you write a query, that would be, if it returns a result, that would be your data set. Okay, so the data set could be multiple. Let's say if you have a report with 5 data sets, so one that just gives you the header information, the second gives you detail, third gives you another something else. So if you have 5 queries returning 5 different data sets, you can have 5 different data sets in here. It could be possible that you have 5 data sets, all are coming from different sources. So you can add 5 data sources in here. So you can have as many data sources you want, as many data sets you want within the one report. Okay, so with all these options, what we're going to do is, first thing that we want to start is creating a simple tabular report. Now what is a tabular report? It's just, you think about a table and then it has all the data in it. No parameters, nothing. The basic report is the tabular report. We're not going to ask any parameter from the user. What the user do is the user go inside the report server, he click on the report, and the report run by itself. He don't have to do anything. So there could be some those kind of reports in there, right? Within the database that just doesn't take any parameter. So if you see this report, what I did is I had a data source in here, I had a data set in here, and then this is a table that I had, and I put all those fields from the data set in this one. So it's just nothing but a simple table, and these are the column values, these are the headers. So these are coming from the data set, and this is just the hard-coded or the header name. So if I click the preview, this is what the report gonna look like once we're done with doing the reports. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create an employee report. How many employees are there in the company? What's their contact ID? Who is their manager? What's their title? What's their marital status? What's their vacation hour? What's their birth date? Okay, so if we have to create just this kind of report in simple table form, what we have to do. So if you see in here at the bottom of the report, I have the name of the server on which it's running, how many pages are there, what's the name of report, what time it was ran. Okay, so let's say if you take the printout of the report, you know this is up to date at this is good until like whatever the time it was ran, right? We don't have the data in the report after that date and time. Okay, and in here on the top you would see is the name of the report. Okay, so we can create a header, and then that's the name of the report. And then if you have multiple pages, you can navigate through this arrow button going to the next page. Okay, so this is what we're going to create in our project. Okay, is it clear? I mean, it makes sense what we're going to do. All right, so I'm going to switch back to all right, so now what we need to do is, in order to get started, first, as we said, because we're going to have the multiple reports in the project, we need to create a shared data source, and all the reports would be using the same data source, right? Okay, so you right click on the shared data source folder and click add new data source. Okay, add new data source, the first option. When you click on add new data source, you're gonna get the name. So let's say what I do is, if I'm connecting to AdventureWorks database, I give this name as AdventureWorks. Okay, I give the name as AdventureWorks. Okay, and then after the name, you see the second option as the type. If I'm connecting to the SQL Server directly, then you pick the first option. If you're connecting to the Azure, that is cloud-based database for SQL Server, or if you're connecting to analysis services or the Cube, you would be using this one. If you're connecting to Oracle database, SAP, all the different kind of databases are supported in here. ODBC connection, OLDB. If you're connecting to the IBM database, all the things are in here. So we pick the SQL Server because we have the SQL Server. And now you said, okay, I'm going to connect to the SQL Server, but you haven't defined your connection. So what you need to do is you need to click edit. Okay, and then in here you need to put your server name. Okay, so if you don't know your server name, what you can do is you can go to the Management Studio, and it's the same thing that you use to connect to the database engine. Okay, all right, that would be the name of your server. So I go in here and pick my server name, put it in the server name, and then you define how do you log in your server usually. It's the same thing. If you're using Windows authentication, you say Windows authentication. If you use user name and password, you use the SQL Server authentication mode. So when you did the installation, you might have came across this option. How do you want your SQL Server to be running? Do you want the SQL Server to be set up as Windows authentication or SQL Server? All these things, when you're gonna go in the real-time environment, would be set up. Okay, they had done the installation for the server are running. They will, if it's a SQL Server authentication, they will give you user ID and password. That this is the one that you would be using. Now, when you're in the development, you can use your own credentials, but when you go to the production, okay, so let's say you developed all the reports and it makes the production. When it's in the production, you never ever use your user ID and password. What would happen if you use your, everyone who is running the report would be using your credentials to run the reports, right? So different people can have different access to the data. So we're going to see when we're going to deploy the reports, how you can overcome those kind of situations, how the user can be prompted when they run the report for their username and ID and password. Or if it's a Windows authentication, if you use the Windows authentication, it automatically picks up their Windows ID, Windows login ID, right? So and in the SQL Server authentication mode, we're going to see how do we set up, so that there are different ways of setting up the SQL Server authentication. Sometimes what people will do is either they create a separate SQL Server account for getting into the SQL Server. So think about this scenario. It's a very important thing. In company, if you have 10,000 employees, okay, and each of them are running report from report server, but not all the 10,000 have access to the database, okay? So when they run the report, they cannot run the report if you have set up in the SQL Server authentication mode, because they don't have access to the SQL Server. Who has the SQL Server access? Only the developer or the people who uses the SQL Server. But the business people don't need to have access to the SQL Server. In that scenario, what you're going to do? Okay, so even you use the Windows authentication mode, it's not going to work, because their Windows credentials are not even authenticated by SQL Server. Basically, they don't have access to the SQL Server. So in that scenario, what is done is they create a separate SQL Server account for the reports, okay, and that the same account you would save inside the connection. What you're doing, you're creating a connection in here, right? You're creating a shared data source, so that account would be saved in here. So instead of using your account, you put that username, ID and password, and you save it in the report. That would be a shared account, and that has the limited privileges. So in that way, you're not using yours. And if there are 10,000 people in the company, not everyone have to have access to SQL Server. So the SQL Server account that you have created would be used in here at that time when they run the report. So they don't have to type the password. They don't need to know the password. What you do is you save username and password. So whenever they come in the report server, they run the report, they would be able to run it. Now you can ask me, the next question would be, how then, if anyone can come in the report server, would be able to run it? No. Windows Server, the SQL report server, no one can get in. It needs an access. So there are 2-layer authentication process. First, to get into the report server, and then get into the SQL server. So you give all the people, 10,000 people, access to the report server, but not to the SQL server. Yep. So what is happening is your SMS is not able to talk to your server, because server is not running right now. So once it's open up, so you see the SQL Server 2016. Yeah. So what happens is sometime even it automatically shut down if you don't use it for a couple of days, even though it's automatic. But Windows is so smart that it don't want to run the things that are not running for like a couple of days. So because it uses the resources when the SQL Server is running, it shut down automatically. So if you have that instance specific error, you cannot connect. It means your SQL Server is not working or not running. So you come in here, you do start. Once it says running, you would be able to connect. Perfect. Then it's always good idea to test the connections to make sure, like it says test connection succeed, so you know your data source can talk to the database. You click OK, and then it's going to create a connection string for you. Okay, so now once you're done with this, you see in here on your left hand side, you would see 2 options, general and the credentials. Okay, so this is the same thing that I was talking about when you are in the report server, it says right now it's in Windows authentication because that's the way we set up, right? Or what you can do is, if you change the mode of authentication, you can come in here and you can say, okay, use this username and password that you want for the report to run, or prompt for credentials when the user runs the report. So let's say you don't want, so for now what you can do is you can use your credentials. You can use this option, right? You put your username, ID and password. But when you publish to the report server, what you can say is, okay, I'm changing it now, prompt for credential, right? So what it's going to do is, if it's a SQL Server authentication that is used for all the employees, then it will prompt for, okay, provide me the credentials to run the report, okay, or do not use the credentials. So this would be the fourth would be the case when you don't have to get the user put anything, right? So if you are creating a SQL Server account and then you save it inside the report server, when you have like 10,000 employees and you don't want to give them access to the SQL Server, what you do is you put the username, ID and password in here, you save it, and then click OK. You don't have to do anything, okay? Don't worry about this do not use credential, because if you're not, this would be the option when you're not connecting to SQL Server, okay? So you leave as this one as Windows authentication, click OK, and you expand, you're gonna see the shared data source created, right? Okay, once the shared data source is created, right now we don't have any of the shared data set in here, right? Because right now we're not going to do anything about the company name or anything, but we'll do it later. What I would do is I would jump on the left hand side, report data panel. In here, first thing that you need to do is connect that report to the data source, okay, in here as well. So once you have the shared data source, you don't need to create every time. In all the reports, all you need to do is point to this data source. How you going to point to this data source? In the data source, you're going to right click and say add data source, okay? And if say add data source, it's going to ask for the adventure. It's going to ask for the name. So you say adventure works, the same name you can say it, okay? Now in here, you will see two different options, embedded connection and use shared data source reference. So when you click on use shared data source reference, you see there is a drop down in here, and all the options that you have, if you have 5 shared data sources in here, it will show all 5, and then you pick the one you want, okay? And then you click OK. All right, but before clicking OK, let's see what the other option is, embedded connections. What this option is, this is nothing but if you don't want to use the shared data source and you want the report to have its own data source, then you don't need to create the shared data source. You come in here, you click on embedded connection, you select which server you want to connect to, what kind of server, it's analysis services or Oracle or SQL Server. You pick that and then you click on the edit, and the same process you follow in here, right? Put your server name, put your database name, select the authentication mode, test connection, click OK. What it would do is it would create a local embedded connection within the report, okay? So this is not preferable. We always try to use the shared data source. So if anything changes with the connection string, you know now what the connection string is, right? The server name, the database name, and the type of authentication. Anything changes, you just change at the shared level, so you don't need to worry about the report level, because now the report is pointing to which one? To the shared one. So you don't need to come in here when anything changes. The last option you see in here is checkbox, use single transaction when processing the queries. So let's say when you select the data from the report from the SQL Server, right? You can have multiple queries, right? I told you your data sets can have multiple queries. Either the data sets can have 5 queries, 10 queries. So you can have 5 data sets and 10 data sets. So it's saying, do you want, for all the query that you have, do you want to use a single transaction, or you want per data set each transaction? Now what would be the difference between that? So let's say your server has so much load that it's per second it's updating about 100 rows in your database, okay? So think about when your first query runs, and your second query runs and your last query run, there would be a time lag in between, right? Because first query runs and then it reaches to the last query, there might be a change in the data or the differences in the data because your server has a high load and it's getting the data from the web server, or like the people who are ordering the data, you're getting the data in your databases continuously, right? So if you say, okay, I don't want to use the single transaction, the first query can have some data that would be the least updated one, or the last query that get the data is the most updated one, right? Because it's running at the last point of time. So let's say if the total time between these 5 queries is 5 minutes. So think about the first query get the data, which is the 5 minutes in past, and the last query that gets the data is the latest data. So if there is some correlation between these, this could create problems in the report. So it's always a good idea to use a single transaction when processing the queries. Now what does it do is it locks the database when it runs the query. It basically starts the transaction, right? It starts the transaction. It's gonna get all the data at the same point of time because it has a transaction. Once the transaction is started, it's gonna get all the data that is it's approximate in the same time. Okay, so it doesn't has to do one query at a time. Okay, so it does like start the transaction, run all the 5 queries and close the transaction. Okay, so I mean, if you usually it's, I mean, if you check or uncheck, it's not the case because most of the reports are ran from static database. They are not ran from the, so there are 2 different kind of database, right? One is the transaction server and one is the analysis server, or like the data warehouse. So usually nowadays you don't run the report from the transaction server directly. All are ran from the data warehouse, right? Or the analysis server. So if you're running from there, the data is not changing, because what you do is you run the ETL to transfer the data from OLTP to the data warehouse like every 3 hours or nightly. So you check or uncheck this option when you're running from the data warehouse, it doesn't make any difference. But if you're running the data from the ODS, then that time this option might play in role. What is the ODS? The ODS is nothing but it's a staging data in between the in your OLTP and your data warehouse. So let's say your data warehouse, you update the data in the midnight. Okay, so if you're running the report today in the daytime, what is the latest data that you can get from that report from the data warehouse until last night, right? What would be the latest data that you can get from your data warehouse if it's updated midnight? The midnight data, right? No matter when you run, even if you're running tonight at 11 p.m. the reports, that would reflect the data that would be updated last night, right? So in that scenario, this transaction is just one transaction that is happening and it doesn't make much difference. Now what is the ODS? The ODS is the staging server between the OLTP and the data warehouse. So instead of putting the data every 3 hours into your data warehouse, because it takes a lot of time, what you do is you have the same structured ODS and you put the data in there. So every hour or so from OLTP to your ODS. Okay, so if you have to get the latest reports, like what is going on within the last 5 hours, or what are the reports between the last 10 hours, so if you have to get the latest reports till the point of time that you are running the report, you would be going against ODS to get the real-time data. But if you have to run the reports for like a day before or so, then you would be going to the data warehouse. So there are different kind of servers that are set up in the industry and based on what kind of data you're fetching. So ODS is just an intermittent data base that you would be using to fetch the real-time data. Now why do you need to set up the ODS? Why you cannot go against the OLTP directly? Even before I go to that, do you understand OLTP, ODS and the data warehouse, Alex? transaction server. Yeah, but Mhm. Okay, so the ODS is nothing but staging the data. So let's say if your data warehouse, let's talk a little bit about OLTP, ODS, and all of this. So OLTP is your customer facing database. So let's say if I have if the Bank of America is doing their transaction, that's application facing database or the server would be called OLTP. Okay, now because your OLTP, you cannot do the analysis on that, right? So let's say if inside the company they want to do the analysis that for their customers, they cannot do the OLTP. So what they do is they copy everything from the OLTP to the data warehouse every midnight or every 6 hours, however the routine is set up, right? Right. So what you're trying to do is why you're copying the data every night, why don't the people within the company in Bank of America can go to the OLTP server directly to get the data till that point of time? Why you cannot do is because you're trying to divide the load. Think about the load on the OLTP server when Bank of America site is would be running, right? It has thousands of customers, and then you don't want to run your analysis on that server to make it more load, right? So if you load the server by analysis and the business, it would run slow, and then the customer would be unhappy. So that's why you try to keep separate the customer facing database and the analysis databases. Because when you do the analysis, the query are not short. The transaction queries are very short. The transaction says, okay, I gave $100, I took the $100. That kind of transactions are very quick. But when you do the analysis, you would be running on all the customers that you have in a particular region. It might take like 10 minutes. So while you're running that query, the customer don't want to sit for 10 minutes. So that's why you keep two things separate. For the analysis within the company, you have data warehouse, and the customer facing application database would be the OLTP. Now, what happens is, let's say when you're doing the analysis and you need the real-time analysis. I told you cannot go to the OLTP. So what you do is you create the same structured database or the server that is a copy of your OLTP. So yes, OLTP. That is nothing but the ODS. So that OLTP will put the data into the ODS every 15 minutes or every hour. Okay. Now why don't you put every 15 minutes or every hour into the data warehouse? Because the ODS is the same structure. You know there is a difference in the structure between the OLTP and the data warehouse. The OLTP is the normalized database, and the data warehouse is the denormalized database. So there are differences in the structure. So when you try to put the data from normalized to denormalized databases, it takes a lot of time for transforming the data. That's where the SSIS comes in. When you transform the data from OLTP to the data warehouse, right? And if you do that every 15 minutes, it takes a lot of processing, it takes a lot of time, and your tables will be blocked. So what you do is you create the same table structure, normalized structure in the ODS, and then you move the data. It's very fast. So what you need to do that time, you don't need to transform the data. All you need to do is copy and paste. Make sense? So that's what the ODS is, to fill the real-time requirement for the data. So it might be the ODS would have like 6 months of data, that's it. But the data warehouse might have the years and years worth of data since it started. Okay. All right. So you know in the SQL Server, whenever you have like 5 queries and you say begin transaction, and if you there is implicit transaction and explicit transaction, right, in the SQL Server. So what's the implicit transaction? Implicit is the SQL Server by itself say, okay, after every query you run, it will begin transaction, commit transaction, begin, commit, if you don't define anything. But if you have 5 queries and you say begin transaction, you define explicitly in your query at the starting, what happens? It won't commit or it won't roll back until you say to the SQL Server. So let's say if you're running like 25 queries, you started with begin transaction, all the queries would be part of one transaction. And then you say commit transaction, it means all the query has to be succeed or none would be succeed. So when you have the begin transaction defined and if your 24th one will fail, you say, okay, if any of the query that I have written would fail, I would roll back my transaction. That's when the explicit transaction plays in role. So you're not going to do anything with your queries. But with the implicit transaction, if your 24th query will fail, you cannot do anything. All the 23 queries are ran already and they're committed because you don't define the transaction. So you cannot roll back anything. Okay, so in the implicit, the SQL Server invokes the transaction for each query individually. But when you say, okay, begin the transaction and do all the query together, that's where your transaction begin and end. So the same thing, when you check on this one, you're doing the implicit transaction. Sorry, explicit transaction. When you leave it unchecked, it's an implicit transaction. For each query, the transaction will happen and finish individually. Okay. So there are lots of things surrounding it. When to use implicit and when to use explicit transaction. But we don't go much into the detail. But you can leave because most of the reports are ran from ODS or the data warehouse. You can leave as is. You don't need to do anything. Okay. So you click OK in here. You see this. There is a difference between this database and this one. You see the pointer in here, a small one that is pointing to this AdventureWorks. Okay. If you change anything in here, it would automatically be changed because it's pointer. There is no connection string in here. Okay. All right. So now once you have this, what you need to set up, the next thing you would be setting up is the query that you would need to run from the database, right? So that is nothing but the data set. So we're going to write a SQL query that would become our data set from the table that we have to get the data. So let's switch it back to the Management Studio, and what we're going to do is we're going to pick one table from where we want to run our or from where we want to fetch our data. So let's say this time I say for Tabular report I'm going to pick the data from let's say person.contact. Okay. So I'm going to pick my data from person.contact. My query would be, I just say select top 1000 rows. Okay. That's my query. So we're just trying to like make the simple query, and then so you take the query and then you're going to go back to the Visual Studio. Alright, so I copy my query and then go back to the Visual Studio. And now when I'm on the data set, I have my query, right? I click on the right click on the data set, say add data set, and name the data set. So I say the name of my data set is contact, because person.contact is the table. Now it's saying, do you want to use the shared data set or embedded query in my report? So if you have a data set created in here and you want to use that one, you go with this option. Else what you can do is, I want to create my own query in the report. So I use the second option because I'm putting my query within the report, right? So the query that I created, I know I'm not going to use for all the reports. This query is specific to this report. So that's why I'm not creating a shared data set. Okay, I'm creating a data set within the report. Now, when you click on the second option, embedded data set in my report, it says which is the database you're going to run the query against. So I say AdventureWorks, right? And is it you're going to have the query in here, or you want to use the stored procedure, or you want to go with the query designer? So if you go in the query designer, it's a GUI that will help you to pick the table and then write the query. Okay. So for now, we'll just say, okay, this is my query I have. I paste it in here and I click OK. All right. So when you click OK, it will create a data set called contact. Okay. So now you have the data set created from the shared data source, right? Okay. So before going further, we end in here, and in the next class we continue building the report, okay, because it's already 9:15. So in the next class we're gonna go over is how do you gonna pull the columns that you have in here, how to format the body of the report, how to give the header, how to give a nice footer, how to format the report, how to align the columns in the reports, like if you have to do center, left line, right line, how do you control the decimal places, all those kind of things. Okay, so any questions?